Imagine, like someone from like way, way back, over 2,000 years ago, and their ideas are still like echoing in all these discussions about like suffering, knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, what we even are. Was this person, was he like a religious founder, some kind of mystic lost to the mists of time, or something else entirely? Today we're diving deep, and I mean deep, into the thought of the Buddha and asking a question. That never gets old. Can we really call him a philosopher? Like, is that a fair label?
Yeah, that's the part of it, isn't it? What we're going to be doing today, we'll be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the entry on Buddha, to see how scholars are approaching this question. Like right now, what are they thinking? Our mission for you, fellow philosophy fan, is to understand the arguments
against
calling the Buddha a philosopher. And to do that, we got to look at his teachings on suffering, on the self. And this is really key, the role of reason, in this whole project, this whole deal.
So, okay. At first glance, you might think, well, yeah, he was a philosopher. Easy peasy. I mean, the guy had big ideas. He talked about them. And then, bam, a whole intellectual tradition. It all comes from him. But
yeah,
the entry we're looking at, it says, not so fast. There's a real debate here. So, like, what's the pushback? Why are some scholars hesitant to just slot him in as a philosopher?
Right. So the main hang-up is this argument that the Buddha, he wasn't all about, like, abstract philosophy, just for the fun of it. No. For him, it was way more practical, like deeply practical. He was all about freeing people from suffering, getting to nirvana, And some scholars, they say that the philosophical systems, the really complex stuff that came later in Buddhism, that they kind of like, I don't know, retroactively made him into a philosopher, when really his focus, it was all about soteriology, saving people.
So it's about like his motivation. Was he trying to build a whole philosophy system, or was he like, hey, there's a real problem here, let's fix it? Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And another point of disagreement has to do with his teachings on the self. The entry, it says that the Buddha, he taught about the impermanence of the five skandhas, form, feeling, perception, all that, the stuff that makes up our experience. But some say he never actually denied a transcendent self, like something beyond these things we can see and feel. But the thing is, most of classical Indian philosophy, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist, they all took him to be denying the self completely. Yeah. And that's a big part of the debate about whether he counts as a philosopher.
Wow. So even way back then in India, people were understanding him in a different way. That's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings us to a tricky problem. The texts we have, the ones that tell us what the Buddha said, they weren't written down until centuries after he died. And they're in different languages than the one he probably spoke. So, there's this gap, this time gap. And this language gap. And it makes you wonder, how accurate are these texts? Could they be biased, by later Buddhist groups? It's a big debate. Can we really know what the original Buddha taught? For our discussion, though, we'll focus on how his ideas were understood by the philosophical tradition that came after him, like the entry does.
Right. So even with the historical stuff, we can still look at his ideas, the ones that took off and really grew. And the entry says that starts with the Four Noble Truths. Now, a philosophy buff, they might know these already, but let's dig in. What makes them more than just some religious thing? Like philosophically, what's the deal?
The Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. They are the foundation, yeah. But from a philosophical point of view, that first truth, the truth of dukkha, or suffering, it's way more than just physical pain or emotional pain. It's like this deep existential unease, like we're never satisfied. And it's because everything's always changing. It's impermanent. As the entry says, the real deep understanding here is that everything we experience, it's all subject to this dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness.
So it's not just that bad things happen, it's that like existence itself, it's always in flux. So we can never really be like truly happy. That's a big statement about being human.
Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. For someone who loves philosophy, someone thinking about what's good, what's a good life, those big questions. The second truth, it talks about where suffering comes from. Traditionally, it's this 12-link chain, dependent origination, starting with ignorance. But some scholars now, they think this might be a later thing, like it was systematized later on. The main idea, though, seems to be that we're ignorant about how things really are. The three characteristics: everything's suffering, everything's impermanent, there's no permanent self. And that ignorance, it leads to clinging, to upadana, this feeling of me and mine. And that just fuels our desires, our aversions. And that's how we get stuck in this cycle of rebirth and suffering. It just keeps going.
So the problem isn't something outside of us. It's us. It's our own minds. We don't get it. We're caught up in this reality we don't truly understand. That's a tough spot to be in.
It is. It is. And the way the Buddha explained this, the origin of suffering, it was as a middle path between two extremes, the philosophical extremes of his time. So you had Shavatavada, that's eternalism, the belief in a permanent self. And then you had Uchidavada, annihilationism, the idea that we just poof, disappear when we die. And the entry says, the Buddha argued, that both these views, they both depend on the idea of a self, a stable I, that either stays the same or gets destroyed. And that's the concept he challenged.
So by saying there's no permanent self, he's like sidestepping the whole argument. That's pretty clever.
Yeah, it is. And this middle path, it was later developed into this distinction between conventional truth, savati satya, and ultimate truth, paramartha satya. And this is really important for understanding later Buddhist philosophy. And it speaks to, these debates in philosophy about reality and language.
Okay, let's break that down. What's the difference between these two truths?
So conventionally real things, these are the things we experience every day. And we think they're real, like a chariot. That's the classic example they use in Buddhist texts. We use the word chariot. It's practical. It helps us communicate. But if we really analyze it, it's just a bunch of parts put together, wheels, axles, a frame. The chariot itself, it doesn't really exist on its own. It's just a concept. We made it up because it's useful and because, our minds work that way.
So it's a label we put on a bunch of simpler things?
Exactly. Now, ultimately, real things, these are the basic element or events, the stuff that makes up these conventional realities. Like, if you could break it all down to the most basic level, that's ultimate truth. So how does this apply to the self? The Buddha's middle path, it says that ultimately. When we analyze a person, we don't find a self. We just find these ever-changing psychophysical events, the 5 skandhas. There's no self hiding in there. Separate from all that. But conventionally, we do talk about persons, and the entry says that can be useful. Like, it helps us be good. We think about the consequences of our actions.
Right.
For ourselves and others in the future. But here's the thing. If we mistake this conventional self for something real, something ultimate, that's when we suffer.
So the self is it's a tool, a useful fiction. But if we start thinking it's really real, it's like a trap. That's a huge statement about, who we are, what it even means to have an identity.
It is, yeah. And this leads right into the Buddha's main philosophical idea, non-self or not man. And the entry's right. This is a big one, and people argue about it a lot.
Okay, let's get into the logic of this. Why a not man? What are the arguments?
The entry talks about 2 main lines of reasoning. The first one is the argument from impermanence. So it goes like this. If there was a self, it would have to be permanent. It wouldn't change. But when we look at the 5 skandhas, form, feeling, perception, all that, none of them are permanent. They're always coming and going, arising and passing away. So the conclusion is there's no permanent self. Not in those elements. Not anywhere.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If what makes me is always changing, then how can there be a me that stays the same? But the entry also says, some people might say, hold on, what about a transcendent self, something beyond these skandhas we can observe?
Right. That's a good question. You could say the Buddha only denied the empirical self, the one we experience. Maybe there's some hidden self underneath it all. But the entry, it points to the early Buddhist texts, and they suggest the Buddha, he didn't like unobservable things. Like, he didn't want to talk about them. It mentions the Pahapada Sutta, the Tavija Sutta, these dialogues where he criticizes people. We talk about unseen seers or Brahman, this ultimate reality you can't observe. So the argument from impermanence, it's like it has this hidden premise that the 5 skandhas, that's all there is. There's no secret self beyond them.
So he's not into speculating about things you can't see or experience, which means he probably thought it's all just these changing elements, no more, no less.
Yeah.
And the entry also says that permanent in this context. It doesn't mean lasting for a second. That came later. And Buddha's not permanent. It means something that would last across lifetimes, because of rebirth.
Exactly. And the entry also talks about how the Buddha understood the mind. It wasn't like a thing, a solid thing. It was more like a flow of mental events always changing. So that makes it even harder to imagine a stable self.
Yeah.
The one who's experiencing everything or doing things.
Okay, so that's impermanence. What's the other argument? The other big one for non-self.
That's the argument from control. Sometimes it's called the argument from lack of ownership or agency. It basically says this: if there was a self, we should be able to control it completely, and we wouldn't want it to be any different. But if you look at the 5 skandhas, we want to change them. We want our bodies to be healthy, our feelings to be pleasant, our perceptions to be accurate. We want good thoughts, clear consciousness. So the things we might identify as me, we can't control them, and we want to change them so they can't be the true self, the enduring self.
That idea that we wouldn't want to change our true self, it's interesting. Why is that?
Well, the entry suggests that the self is seen as the one in control, like the ultimate controller. So if it was really in charge, it could just change itself however it wanted. But we all know our desires and our reality, they don't always match up. And that shows we don't have that kind of control. So no fixed self, no controller self. Another way to think about it is it's like this philosophical principle, irreflexivity. So something can't act on itself in the same way it acts on other things. If the self was the one controlling, it couldn't also be the one being controlled, or the one it wants to be different.
Yeah. If the self is like the boss, it can't also be the employee.
Right. This really messes with our idea of like free will, this whole idea that we can change ourselves. Yeah, for sure. And this argument, it shows the clash between how we usually think about agency, that we're in charge, and the Buddhist idea that we're just these interdependent things, always changing, with no one really in control. And this brings us to a big question. How does non-self work with karma and rebirth? If there's no self that's like moving from one life to the next, then how does that all make sense?
Yeah, that's a tough one. If there's no me after this life, then who gets the good karma? Who suffers the bad karma? How can it be fair if there's no one to be rewarded or punished?
It's a question that's bothered people for a long time, philosophers, even some Buddhists. The entry says some people think it's such a big problem that they question rebirth. They say maybe there's no rebirth rather than questioning non-self.
Wow, like a philosophical puzzle. But the entry says the Buddha himself, he believed in both, right? Karma and rebirth.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all over his teachings. He talked about it with everyone, lay people, monks. And for him, karma, it wasn't just like some vague tendency. He said that every action you do intentionally, like with your body, your speech, your mind, it has specific consequences. And those consequences, they'll come back to you in the future. And that's why we're reborn, because of these underlying defilements, desire, aversion, ignorance, they keep us stuck. But if you get rid of those, like the Buddha did, your actions, they don't have karmic consequences anymore.
Okay, so he believed in both. But how did he explain it? How can you have no self, but also karma and rebirth? Did he try to reconcile those ideas?
This is where that middle path comes in again. The Buddha, he famously said that the person you are now and the person you were in a past life, they're neither the same nor different. And the entry explains this is like his way of avoiding those extremes. It's not like a soul that jumps from one body to the next. And it's not like you just vanish and there's no connection to the future.
Neither the same nor different. That's a bit of a head scratcher. Like it's on purpose, right?
Yeah.
To make us think differently about identity.
Exactly. He's saying there's no real lasting self that carries karma from one life to another. So he's not falling into that trap of eternalism, but he's also saying there's a connection between your actions and what happens to you in the future. So no nihilism either. And this is where conventional reality is important. We talk about people and their actions and whether they're good or bad, and that's useful. It helps us be ethical. It helps us reduce suffering. But ultimately, it's just these impersonal events happening in a chain, thinking about people. It's just a way for us to see where we can make a difference, by changing our actions and getting rid of the bad stuff that motivates us.
So it's like a way to understand morality and cause and effect.
Yeah.
Without needing a self. It's more about the flow of things, not about some fixed thing moving around.
Exactly. And the entry does say, it's hard to wrap your head around this. It mentions the traditional Buddhist idea that you can see your past lives through yoga, retrocognition. But the point is, philosophically, it's possible to have rebirth without a self, as long as there's a causal link between lives.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. About who we are, about how things are connected. Now let's move to the last big point in the entry. The Buddha's view on reason. Was he just a practical guy, showing people how to be free, or did he actually value philosophy and logic?
Yeah, that's another tricky one. Yeah. There are times when the Buddha, He just refused to answer certain questions about like what happens to an enlightened person after they die or how the universe began. He said those questions, they're distractions. They don't help you end suffering. He used this analogy, the poisoned arrow. If you're shot with an arrow, you don't waste time debating where the arrow came from or what kind of poison it is. You just get the arrow out and heal. It's all about being practical.
That sounds like someone who's like less talk, more action.
Right. But the entry makes another point. It says that sometimes the Buddha, he used reason to take apart those metaphysical questions, the ones he wouldn't answer directly. Like, there's this example, the extinguished fire. People asked him, where does the fire go when it goes out? And he pointed out the question itself. It assumes that the fire still exists somewhere. And it's the same with questions about, like, what happens to the arhat after death? They assume there's still a self, something that continues. So he was using reason strategically to help people understand, to clear up confusion.
So it's not that he rejected reason completely. It's more like he used it in a specific way to address suffering. Because a lot of times suffering comes from like our own wrong ideas about ourselves, about the world.
Exactly. And the entry, it touches on this tension between relying on the Buddha's authority. Like in Buddhism, they say only Buddhas know how karma really works. So there's that. But then there's also this emphasis on personal understanding, figuring things out for yourself. But then later on, you have all these Buddhist philosophical schools, and they're debating with other Indian philosophers. So they had to defend their views with arguments, not just by saying, Buddha said so. So it seems like for the tradition that came after him, reasoning, it became really important.
So maybe the Buddha himself, his main goal wasn't to create a whole philosophy, but his ideas. They raised all these philosophical questions. And then his followers, they used reason to explore them.
Yeah, spot on. The entry concludes by saying that even though the Buddha was focused on freedom, on liberation, his insights, they basically started a whole philosophical tradition, a really rich one. And it's still going, still grappling with these fundamental questions about, reality, knowledge, ethics.
Okay, so to sum it all up for our listener who's been following along, the question of whether the Buddha was a philosopher, it's not a simple answer. He was mainly focused on freeing people from suffering. And he didn't always want to talk about abstract ideas. But his teachings, especially about non-self and suffering, they are philosophical. And he did use logic and reason to challenge people's assumptions. And then the tradition that followed him, it's definitely philosophical.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's not black and white.
So for you, our listener, who loves philosophy, think about this. The Buddha's middle path between extremes. His idea of conventional truth and ultimate truth. Does that mean he rejected philosophy, like philosophy just for the sake of it? Or did he redefine it, like philosophy that's all about ending suffering? And how does that make us think differently about philosophy today? Maybe we should focus more on real problems, on making people's lives better. When we're thinking about reality, knowledge, all that, it's something to think about.
Absolutely. It makes us ask, why are we doing philosophy? What's the goal? Maybe focusing on suffering, on how to end it. Maybe that's a way to look at those big philosophical questions in a new way, a valuable way.